And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this strong low pressure area slowing its northward advance as it begins to now just drift a little farther to the north, west of the Pribilof Islands. Front pushing up, bringing snow and blowing snow with winter storm warnings out for the Yukon Delta and St. Lawrence Island for winds gusting to 60 miles an hour, resulting in blowing snow and reduced visibilities. A weaker portion of this front moving into the Kuskokwim Valley and down across south central Alaska for a chance of snow there. Drying out and clearing out. Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay behind the front, and then a lot more wind and showers here covering all of the Aleutians, southern Bering Sea, Copper River Basin, eastern North Gulf Coast, all the way up to the Arctic coast, dry with light winds, Panhandle, dry. And for tomorrow, it stays dry with some sunshine for the southeast coast, much of the interior as well. And kind of a new front developing. This is the remnants of the first one, but another one developing here and moving to about this position tomorrow afternoon along the coast there into a weak low near Kodiak for rain there. Chance of some moisture on the south coast of the Kenai Peninsula into Prince William Sound. Maybe southern Cook Inlet. Not too bad for the southeast coast. And improving conditions here over the Bering Sea as this system weakens, and then it really weakens on Thursday, drifts up to just east of St. Matthew Island. Still a little breezy with some snow, western Seward Peninsula, especially the Bering Strait, light snow, Cape Lisburne, Point Hope. Dry in the interior. Here's the next system coming up with increasing wind, rain, and snow with it for the eastern Aleutians, with moisture sliding and increasing winds for the western Gulf of Alaska and in toward the southern Kenai Peninsula. Coastal water forecasts for the south coast, north winds 10 to 15 knots. For the day on Wednesday, central coast kind of variable at 10 knots and then east at 15 for the north coast. Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, north winds 15 knots, Clarence Strait, northwest at 10 knots. And the outlook for Thursday, all of the inside waters here, north winds 15 knots with seas running 3 feet. And central and south coast, east winds at 20 knots, north coast, east 15 to 20 knots. And for Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest south of the Forelands. East winds at 25 knots for Kamishak Bay. 20 knots out of the east for the Barren Islands. Western North Gulf Coast, variable winds 20 knots or less. And east winds of 15 to 20 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. And Prince William Sound, expect an east wind at 15 knots with 3-foot seas. And then those become even lighter, northeast at 10 for the Sound on Thursday. Small craft advisories for the eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 25 knots. Gale warnings here for the west side, northeast at 35 knots. Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, east winds at 40 knots. And northeast winds 30 knots, southern Cook Inlet, and about 20 knots for northern Cook Inlet. And for the Alaska Peninsula tomorrow, south to southwest winds 25 to 40 knots. Bristol Bay southeast at 30. And Kodiak Island east southeast 15 to 20 knots. And moving on to Thursday, for the Alaska Peninsula here, gale warnings, east northeast winds 35 to 45 knots. Gale warnings also for Bristol Bay, east winds 35 knots. And Shelikof Strait, east winds 35 knots, east side of Kodiak Island, east winds 40 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, pretty simple, gale warnings, southwest winds 40 knots. Gale warnings for the central Aleutians, west winds 35 knots. And small craft advisories for the western Aleutians for west-northwesterlies at 25. Those become even lighter on Thursday. Western Aleutians, west-northwest at 15 to 20 knots. Adak and Atka, west winds coming down to 20 knots with seas subsiding to 7 to 8 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians, small craft advisories for west to north winds at 25 to 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, gale warnings, southeast winds 35 knots, southwest 35 for the Pribilofs. Otherwise, northeast winds 40 knots there for St. Matthew Island, St. Lawrence Island, southeast at 30 and east at 30 for Norton Sound. For the day Thursday, Norton Sound, southeast 25, southeast 30 for St. Lawrence Island. Brisk wind advisories here for the southwest coast, southeast at 25 knots. And by comparison, lighter winds out of the southwest at 15 knots for the Pribilof Islands, west at 20 for St. Matthew Island. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds 15 knots. Central coast east at 20, and the western coast northeast winds at 20 knots, and the Chukchi Sea east winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the day Thursday, brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea, east winds at 25 to 30 knots, with the western Arctic coast looking at northeasterlies 15 to 20 knots. And the central coast, actually central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 10 to 15 knots.